So, March 1938, German troops march into Austria. Although the Austrian government certainly opposed this, most Austrians don't seem to have. Many were out in the streets clapping, giving fascist salutes as the German troops marched through. And the rest of Europe turned a blind eye to it, assuming that, well, this is not a cause for war. We're still hesitant to do so. However, for Hitler, this was even further encouragement. Now he began to set his sights on the East, in Eastern Europe. And the first place he set his sights on was Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was a new nation. It had been created out of old Austro-Hungarian land, German land, and there was an area of the new nation of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. It's in your notes, the Sudetenland. And this was a German-speaking area. And Hitler said the Sudetenland needs to be under the control of the German nation. Of course, everybody knew that if he took the Sudetenland, he was going to take all of Czechoslovakia. Now, as a new nation, Czechoslovakia's defense had been guaranteed by Britain and France. After the Versailles Treaty and Czechoslovakia had been created, Britain and France said, we will watch over the security of this new nation until they're able to take care of themselves. So by threatening Czechoslovakia, he was really inviting the wrath of Britain and France. However, the Prime Minister of Britain, a man named Neville Chamberlain, who was really dedicated, committed to creating this welfare state in Britain, wanted to avoid war. In September of 1938, Chamberlain met Hitler in Munich to discuss Hitler's plans for Czechoslovakia. And essentially what Chamberlain did was he sacrificed Czechoslovakia. He said, you can take Czechoslovakia as long as you promise you don't want anything else. Hitler, with his fingers crossed behind his back, said, no, I don't want anything else. That's all I want. And Chamberlain famously flew back to London and had something in his hands called the Munich Agreement, in which he said, with this paper, I have guaranteed peace in our time. He gave up. He gave in. He was an appeaser, even to this day. And when people talk about giving in to enemies, they say, don't be an appeaser like Neville Chamberlain. And he's been given a pretty bad rap in history in many ways. And it's understandable. He ended up on the wrong side and made a wrong decision. You have to understand that Neville Chamberlain, though, however, why he did it. He was trying to create this welfare state in England. He didn't want a war. However, all he did really is encourage Adolf Hitler. Now Hitler began to set his sights on a country even further east, and that was the nation of Poland. Poland is an interesting nation. Throughout history, it comes and it goes. Sometimes it exists, sometimes it doesn't exist. Sometimes it's occupied by other countries, then it disappears, and then it reappears. After the Versailles Treaty, Poland was reestablished as a nation, and its security was also guaranteed by Britain and France. The problem with Poland, as far as Hitler was concerned, wasn't Britain and France. The problem with Russia. He wasn't ready to go against war against the great Russian bear, as they called it, in 1939. And certainly Stalin wasn't prepared to go to war against Germany, having purged most of his military and his officer corps. So they signed a treaty, a non-aggression pact of 1939, in which Hitler promised that if Russia did nothing and allowed them to simply walk in and take over Poland, Russia would get control of many of the eastern districts of Poland. Having signed that treaty, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Now the British have to do something. The French have to do something. This has gone too far. Clearly, Hitler's not a man of his word. Hitler has greatest plans. And so on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II in Europe begins. Now, for the first 6 months of the war, not much really happens. In fact, the first 6 months of the war is known as the phony war. They had a lot of speeches, a lot of yelling and screaming, but not much really goes on. The major event that goes on really is Britain gets a new prime minister. Instead of Neville Chamberlain, who obviously had failed with the Munich Agreement, we get Winston Churchill, a known militarist, and a man who certainly was not much of a leader unless you're at war. And certainly in war, he was a very good leader. Winston Churchill comes to power in Britain, and declares that we will fight in the sands and the beaches and the skies and everywhere, and we will never give up, in his very famous Churchillian speeches. France said they were going to fight, and they did, for about 6 weeks, which seems to be the amount of time that France usually stands up against Germany. There's a very bad history joke, guys, which I will share with you, which probably only historians really appreciate. It says, why are the streets of France lined with trees? So the Germans can march in the shade. Because Germans were often marching in and out of France. By May 1st, the French had conceded, and most of France was occupied by Germany. It was a area of France called Vichy France. Some French troops and others escaped and went to North Africa, continue the war under Charles de Gaulle's leadership. But France was essentially out of the war. Now Germany has only Britain to stand against them. In order to invade Britain, however, you're going to have to transport a lot of troops to the island. And that means sailing across the English Channel, England's greatest military buffer, defender against invasion over many centuries. And the only way you could do that, if you did that, you're going to have to deal with not just the British Navy, but you're going to have to deal with the Royal Air Force. And a very good chance you would lose a large number of your troops in the English Channel. So Germany's plan was essentially to destroy the RAF, get control of the skies. If you got control of the skies, you could then deal with the Royal Navy between the German Navy and the what was known as the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could deal with the English, with the Royal Navy. The man who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was a man named Göring, Hermann Göring. Göring had promised Adolf Hitler that Germany would never be invaded and that he would crush the RAF. And at first, there was a lot of success at this. They bombed RAF airfields. They were destroying planes and, more importantly, killing pilots. But in the summer of 1940, Hitler changed direction. Instead of going after the RAF airfields, Hitler went after the cities, and he began to send the bombers to the cities. Now, one reason for that was because of a single attack of British bombers that had made their way to Berlin and bombed Berlin one time. And it was a kind of desperate kind of try to show that we can fight back that Churchill had put together. Hitler was so angered by this that he directed the Luftwaffe to hit English cities, and the bombings of London and other cities began. But that took most of the resources away from bombing the RAF. Bad move on his part. The RAF survived, began to win in its air battle against the Luftwaffe. By the end of 1940, really the attempts to invade Britain were at an end. This is known as the Battle of Britain, summer of 1940. Hitler got tired of this, and really, if you remember, guys, that's not really where his focus is. His focus is on the East. So he felt that we've got Britain bottled up there. Let's focus on the East. So in 1940, he began in earnest the invasion of Russia. The invasion of Russia went very well, as it often does in history for invaders. They often start off very well, like a Napoleon Bonaparte, and then they hit a bad winter, usually unprepared for the kind of Russian winter they're about to hit, which is certainly true of the German army. Eventually, while they cut through and had a lot of success in 1942. By 1942, they'd hit Stalingrad. Now, I don't do a lot of battles here, guys, but I will mention this one. And the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Russians, ill-equipped, fought against an invading German army. You really have to give a lot of credit to the valor of the Russians at the Battle of Stalingrad. Their bravery really is astounding when you understand that they had very few or very little equipment, guns, rifles, and so forth. The story of them lining up in threes, the first one with the rifle and the two following behind, and as the first one falls, the second one picks up the rifle, and the second one falls, the third one does. These are true. These events did occur. The Russians were able to stop the Germans at Stalingrad, and in doing so stopped the German invasion of Russia. Now, while these battles are going on, the United States is sending military equipment, troops, and of course money to Britain in support of the British. As far as the war in the Pacific goes, we really didn't focus on that. The United States didn't focus on that until really 1942. In 1942, there were two important naval battles in the Pacific. One was the Battle of Midway, and the other was the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, the Battle of Midway is important because it initially, in 1942, it looked like it was a loss to the United States, and then at best maybe a stalemate. But as they began to look at the results of this battle, what they found was this was in fact a victory for the United States. And the reason being is because they destroyed a Japanese aircraft carrier, a number of large ships, and while the United States also lost major ships, it stopped the Japanese offensive in the Pacific, and that's why the Battle of Midway stands out. From up to that point, the Japanese had been advancing, no one had been able to stop them. But the Battle of Midway, they were stopped, and from this point on, they will be on the defensive. The other battle is the Battle of Coral Sea, and I mention it only because it's of historical interest. The Battle of Coral Sea is the only sea battle in which ships were not actually involved. This is the battle between aircraft carriers and, of course, therefore, a battle between planes attacking ships and attacking each other. Battle of Coral Sea. The Battle of Coral Sea was also a victory for the United States in equipment, although certainly a close one. By the end of 1945, I'm skipping all the major battles, guys. The Germany and its allies are certainly near defeat. April 1945, Germany surrendered. Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Germany surrendered. War in Europe in May of 1945 comes to an end. The Japanese, however, continued to fight. The Japanese had committed themselves to fighting for every inch of territory. The United States in the Pacific found itself fighting for islands, trying to take one island at a time, trying to hop its way to Japan itself, gaining territory that could be created for aircraft carrier or planes, airports that could be send planes to bomb Japan, and they were having success. They even made it to an area that was directly the homeland of Japan, Okinawa. But these battles were all extremely costly in human life. And the Japanese had refused to surrender, had died to the last man, and the result was thousands of Americans' lives. By 1945, the United States had developed a weapon that could end the war, and this weapon was the atomic bomb. We know that in August 1945, the United States will drop the atomic bomb on Japan at Hiroshima. In fact, they dropped two atomic bombs, one in Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. Now, there's debate about this, guys. Certainly a lot of people have said this is a horrible event that you could drop one bomb, 100,000 people die instantly. It's not that kind of death had not occurred already. The firebombing of Dresden in Germany had killed 100,000 people, but it had taken a week or two of constant bombings. The United States had bombed Tokyo and major cities in Japan, but this was a shocking event. Now, the bomb they dropped in Hiroshima, my father was in World War II, and he was in the Pacific. And he said one of the happiest days of his life was when he heard about the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, because he did not want to fight in the Pacific. He did not want to have to hit the mainland of Japan. He had seen the destruction, the death, and he thought that this was a cheap price, Japanese lives price, to end this war. And there's some argument for that. I mean, certainly if you were an American troop or another Allied troop and you saw yourself heading to the mainland of Japan for an invasion, where it was estimated 1 million people would die combined on both sides if the United States attempted this invasion, you could debate this. However, the second bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, this one, I think historically, you could argue, had nothing really to do with the ending of the Second World War. By 1945, the United States and Russia, although they've been allies during the war because they had a greater enemy, Their historical dislike, hatred for each other had begun to rise up again. And the United States wanted Russia to know that we have more than one of these atomic bombs. And there's a very good argument to say that the second atomic bomb dropped on Japan was not really about World War II, but it was about the emerging Cold War that was about to begin, 1945, 1946, the Cold War between the United States and Russia. All right, that's it for World War II, guys. We'll see.